Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Kate Monroe. I am the manager of special collections here at the library. We're so glad you all could join us today for the next installment of our America 250 speaker series. We have made it to the Reconstruction period, and today's speaker is Heather Adkins. She is a public historian and certified archivist whose work centers on underrepresented histories, community memory, and community engagement. She currently serves as the Curator-Archivist of the Alabama State Black Archives Research Center and Museum. Heather, thank you for being here today.
Just pulling a little switcheroo with the microphone at this point. Good afternoon. And yes, it is afternoon. I was about to say morning. Woo! The coffee has not kicked, y'all. It's okay. Thank you so much for the introduction, Kate. As she said, I work for the State Black Archives, which is located on the campus of Alabama A&M University. And as its name suggests, it's dedicated to recording and preserving the Black experience in Alabama. With that being the case, my research tends to pull from a pretty wide array of state and national resources. And I do that to help build a larger context. So when I add in things like local records, it helps create a larger window into history. For day to day, though, Kate asked me to talk a bit about Black history between 1865, which is the end of the Civil War, and the turn of the 20th century. And actually, I'm going to go a little bit beyond that, really more towards about 1910. So it's not really feasible to go into adequate detail on every single facet of post-war society during what is really like a 30 to 40 minute presentation. I could write novels and novels just on singular aspects of post-war society. But that being the case, I'm going to cover three main areas: labor, education, and military service, and really talk about how these three areas interact over time and influence and are influenced by the greater world in which they evolved. I'll also say that these are not the only areas that represent the entire idea of freedom. Freedom as a concept is pretty amorphous. However, I will say that they cover large swaths of that idea. If you consider that labor represents economic freedom, education would be intellectual freedom, and military service would be something more like conditional freedom. And we're going to look at the nuances of that throughout the rest of the presentation. I'll be real honest, the late 1800s in Alabama is a really complicated subject. It's a difficult subject, and honestly, there's a reason why it's often skipped over in early childhood education. It's messy. It's so messy. It's a lot like today, actually. There's a handful of people saying one thing and another handful of people directly refuting that, and there's aspiration and there's reality. And that's a lot of what we see in the post-war decades. So before we get into these areas, there's a few things going on in the background on the national scene. And those things going on in the background really helped steer how the fight for these freedoms evolved. So first things first. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, and particularly in the 1870s, what was going on politically in the South? Does anyone know? Turmoil. That's actually a really good answer. Reconstruction, yeah. Also known as turmoil. I think they're pretty synonymous with one another. So Reconstruction was a set of policies conceived of and implemented by the federal government in an effort to reintegrate the southern states through political engagement and financial recovery. And a major part of that reunion plan dealt with how to include 3 to 4 million newly freed Black individuals as American citizens. There was a lot happening to make Reconstruction hypothetically work. I've seen a lot of recent historians use Reconstruction in quotation marks or say supposed Reconstruction. There was a lot going on to make it hypothetically work. But one of the major issues was the inconsistency of politicians, and particularly the inconsistency of presidents. So for example, Andrew Johnson, a Tennessean who became president after Lincoln's assassination, he ran with Lincoln as his VP candidate in alignment with Lincoln's policies, and they linked up in that way as a way to reach Southern constituents because Johnson was a Tennessean. But after Lincoln's assassination, Johnson reversed a lot of the policies he had previously upheld under Lincoln. Who's heard of 40 acres and a mule? Yeah. 40 acres and a mule was a policy promised under Lincoln and was kind of vaguely sort of in the works of how to work that out. But as soon as the assassination happened, Johnson immediately reversed that decision in order to garner more support with the Southern states for re-election. And that's just one example of the political machinations that were happening during this time period. This time period also gave rise to the Jim Crow laws, meaning that as hard as some politicians were working to ensure civil rights to Black citizens, most of those efforts were at best blockaded and at worst met with violence. Pivoting a little bit, before the war, but especially after, there was an infusion of Northern money into the South. Locally, we can look at examples of this with the cotton mills and particularly Black schools, Black education as well. And with the infusion of Northern money into the Southern economy, there's a rising contention among Southern politicians and especially businessmen who a lot of times were the politicians. The Northerners were helping revive and literally prop up the Southern economy, which had essentially collapsed after the war. But in doing so, they began to have more of what was of a say of what was happening here. Ergo, Southerners were in this weird damned if you do, damned if you don't situation with the so-called carpetbaggers. Who's heard of carpetbagger as a term? Yeah, it actually has a modern bent on it. You hear carpetbagger these days as well. So typically, it was a term used by Southerners to describe opportunistic or perceived disruptive Northerners who came to the South and were, again, perceived, important word there, to be exploiting the local populace for their own financial, political, or social gain. And all of that was analogized in their carpet bag, their weekend suitcase that they brought for their trips to the South before going back up north. Now, were there some Northerners who were trying to take advantage of this situation? Yeah, absolutely, 1,000%. There were some people trying to take advantage. Realistically, though, Southerners applied this term to any and all Northerners present in the South during the Reconstruction era, whether or not they were there to capitalize on post-war chaos. Southerners were as apt to call businessmen carpetbaggers as they were to call Northerners building schools and fighting for Black civil rights carpetbaggers. It was all about perceived infringement on the Southern way of life. And broadly speaking, this concept of infringement comes up over and over again and eventually evolves into the lost cause narrative, which became popular in the early 20th century. Finally, let's talk about the realities of the Freedmen's Bureau. It was formed in 1865 and closed in 1872. And in that 7-year period, a very short period of time, it was very contentious. On the positive side, the Bureau provided education advancements, basic reunification support, basic survival relief, and labor mediation in a time where Black individuals had to start contracting for work. And they also helped with family reunification, if I did not mention that already. On the negative side, it was consistently underfunded and understaffed, making it virtually impossible to enforce policies. Politicians like President Johnson interfered, hampering its authority. And the rise of white supremacist groups led to domestic terror against Bureau agents and its beneficiaries. Think of it this way. The Freedmen's Bureau is widely considered the US's first large-scale welfare program, and it served 4 million freed Blacks and impoverished Southern whites, comprising about 10.3% of the population in 1870. 10 years ago, in 2015, government assistance programs reported aiding about 52 million people, roughly 21% of the population. Consider how today government assistance is highly contested, with ongoing deep political polarization regarding size, cost, and purpose. Then retrospectively, apply that to the Freedmen's Bureau at a time when slavery and the Civil War were fresh wounds. And even more so, think about how this time period gave rise to industrial barons who were about to monopolize and oust from the population, most of the population, from participating in the economy. That's the type of building contention we're really talking about here with the Freedmen's Bureau. So now that we have kind of a brief, broad background about what's happening nationally, let's focus more in on the South and North Alabama and Madison County as we look at labor, education, and military service. So starting with the idea of economic freedom through labor. Industry here was really centered on one thing: cotton. Growing it, selling it, both as a raw product and as a finished processed good. Cotton is extremely labor intensive to plant, harvest, and process, especially pre-technology like giant tractors. And in the antebellum period, that labor fell largely on enslaved people. Yet despite the large enslaved population, most farms before the Civil War were small. They were yeoman farms owned by poor whites, not this sprawling plantation idea that we get from Gone with the Wind. So the 1860 census shows only about 6% of Alabamians owned slaves, and most owned fewer than 10 slaves. And generally speaking, when we talk about the distribution of wealth, if 6% of people owned slaves, most of that was 10 or less slaves, think about the fact that across the broader Deep South, 62% of enslaved people were located on plantations. It really gives a very specific picture about the concentration of wealth among farmers, that the planter elite was still in that upper echelon, that close to 1%, if that were a term used retroactively. So Madison County's early population was nearly split between white and Black residents, with Black residents becoming the majority as the Civil War approached. Again, a very interesting picture into the dynamics of power and wealth. Most enslaved people were presumably agricultural laborers. Free Black population of about 200 also lived in the county. Some of those were farmers, but many of them were also skilled tradespeople like smiths and barbers that often contracted to the white community, especially in Huntsville. After the war, two things really shaped the region. First, Northern investment brought cotton mills, gradually pulling locals away from purely agricultural labor. And second, the Tennessee Valley portion that is in Alabama dropped by nearly 10%. That's specifically the Black population, dropped nearly by 10% after the Civil War. That left fields untended, which resulted in dropping land values, and eventually it resulted in the complete collapse of agricultural income. And it hit hardest those plantations that relied on enslaved labor to do the work. And so recovering agricultural labor became central to stabilizing the post-war Southern economy. So economic freedom often comes down to balancing self-defined self-sufficiency with meeting or exceeding the cost of living. The idea of a career is really a 20th century phenomenon born out of the rigidity of factory jobs, of all things, during the Industrial Revolution. Before that, most people simply followed tradition or local farming, crafting, or trade opportunities. And across the late 1800s, that tradition began shifting as laborers found what was somewhat easier work in local mills, while freedmen and impoverished whites were drawn back into what looked more like equitable farm labor, where profits were split rather than owned outright. Regardless of industry, these decades saw the same demands emerge from laborers: fair wages, reasonable hours, recognition of merit, and equal access to resources and opportunities. The American labor movement grew alongside the Industrial Revolution as society learned in real time how new technologies reshaped work. Notably, much of our population, including women and minorities, still fight for these same rights today. On the other side stood the governing entities, both government and business owners and managers. The key distinction is their goal wasn't necessarily to help laborers, especially Black workers, build a sustainable living. Their goal was to recover the Southern economy by any means necessary. So while those could be mutually beneficial, oftentimes they were at direct odds. For the North, that meant investing in manufacturing in the South. But the South still ran on agricultural labor, and mills, especially here in Madison County, needed cotton, which needed farming. The catch was many plantation owners went bankrupt after the war, but still held on to most of their land. Their choice was to either sell their land to get an immediate profit, and one that immediately ended, as well as a lump sum, or rent it out, which proved over time to be far more profitable for large landowners than selling it ever would. So on paper, the labor system worked. Laborers earned income, owners' debts receded, and the Southern economy recovered. All rainbows on the surface. So let's look at what was actually happening underneath. Tenant farming and sharecropping became known as slavery by another name. After the war, landowners first tried hiring freedmen as paid workers, but the collapsed economy made pay extremely inconsistent, and many laborers ended up housed in the same former slave cabins. So they had work and wages, but psychologically, they're exactly back to where they'd fled. This gap between labor and economy helped popularize sharecropping and tenant farming, where workers farmed the land they didn't own in exchange for a cut of the harvest. Tenant farmers kept 2/3 to 3/4 of the crop minus living expenses. Sharecroppers kept about half, with rent and supply credit plus interest deducted by owners. The system earned its grim nickname because it trapped both newly emancipated Black Americans and impoverished whites in a cycle of debt. restricted mobility, and constant surveillance, stripping them of any real economic independence. Who knows this song? Okay, this is called 16 Tons, and just to be clear, it's actually about Appalachian coal mining in the 1930s and 40s, but the vibe very much tracks with what we're about to cover in manufacturing. So textile mills rose up, and in turn, local cotton into finished products, and with them, mill villages grew alongside them, offering housing, schools, shops, YMCAs, libraries, and other amenities within walking distance. That was a real benefit for workers without horses or mules, carts, or in the case of later technology, cars. But it cut both ways. Having everything nearby meant little reason to leave, and low wages kept people locked into cycles of debt and limited mobility anyway. As far as we know, the mills here didn't run on company stores the way other mining and manufacturing towns did, but between the convenience of village stores, low wages, and long hours, real economic freedom usually stayed out of reach for these mill workers. By the 1890s, tenancy dominated Alabama farming, with sharecroppers producing more cotton per acre than any other group of farming labor. By the Great Depression, 65% of Alabama farmers were tenants, and a share that fell very sharply after the World War II, which really transformed Huntsville and Madison County. Around the turn of the century, a stark shift also began between labor sectors. Within 50 years, the population split between agriculture and manufacturing completely reversed. Several factors drove this. The pull of industrial labor as easier, more stable work, especially in more established northern and western states, combined with Jim Crow era oppression and racial violence, sparked the Great Migration. And during the Great Migration, roughly 6 million Black Americans left the rural South for other states that were more industrialized and capable with manufacturing. Technology also made that mobility possible in the first place. The spread of automobiles, along with the expanding railroad networks, meant workers were no longer tied to walking distance or the distance of a single mule-drawn cart. Growing access to newspapers, mail order catalogs, and later the radio also spread word of opportunities elsewhere, making the decision to relocate for work far more informed and feasible than it had been even a generation earlier. Education also became more attainable for both Black and white workers, even though children as young as 10 could still enter the labor force until about 1915, 1918. As we'll discuss next, this education increasingly emphasized management skills for both agriculture and industry. Agriculture and industrial unions, along with other community organizations, surged in popularity. Those advocated for equitable opportunities and better working conditions. And alongside them, the women's suffrage movement and the child labor laws reshaped how the labor force's demographics looked entirely. Altogether, the 20th century brought social, political, economic, and legislative change that permanently reshaped the American workforce. I'm gonna get a sip of water really quick. Pivoting to intellectual freedom through education. There was a local educator by the name of William Hooper Council. This is the founder and first president of Alabama A&M University, by the way. He was one of the major leaders pushing for Black education in the state. Philosophically, Council maintained that adding theory to agriculture and mechanical arts gave independence to a previously stymied Black labor force. In practice, educated tradesmen would be in high demand, and in turn gain access to land ownership and wealth, two other components which Council believed aided in Black independence. To that end, he politically insisted that Black education would be in the best interest of the Southern economy, engaging legislative decision makers who would ultimately block or invest in state-funded schools. And it is that framing that a lot of Black educators in the post-war era used to fight for resources. Prior to the Civil War, a significant share of US residents were illiterate, namely millions of enslaved individuals, along with a pretty substantial portion of poor whites as well. It's unclear whether federal statistics during this era accounted for immigrants or indigenous Americans in this literacy count as well. In 1860, the US Census recorded roughly 90% literacy among free white adults aged 20 and older. But since enslaved individuals were assumed illiterate and excluded from that metric, the true national rate was likely far lower than that. Among the free white population, literacy tended to stay highly localized. Northern and Western states approached 97 to 98%, while some Southern and Appalachian regions where public schooling was less established saw white illiteracy as low as 15 to 16%, or 85 to 86 literacy. About 90% of African Americans in 1860 were enslaved. And since educating enslaved people was illegal in the South due to slave codes, Black literacy was catastrophically low, an estimated 5 to 10% nationwide. Once the enslaved population is factored in, the true national literacy rate for 1860 drops to roughly probably 80%, if I did my math right. It's a pretty low bar for me doing math correctly. In Alabama, roughly 45% of the total population was enslaved. The adult white literacy rate was around 85%, while overall literacy for the entire population was deeply suppressed by the legal prohibition of education for slaves. After the Civil War, the push for Black education was really hard fought. The Freedmen's Bureau helped set up schools, but funding was usually inadequate, and finding instructors was very difficult. Generally, Black Americans sought to obtain equal education opportunities and resources. Many of the movers and shakers, like William Hooper Council, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois, appealed to state and federal governments to support Black education, using the rationale that an educated workforce was a better workforce. They also fought for local and state governments to show support by taking political and economic responsibility for Black education, much like they had for whites. During the Reconstruction, public schools in Alabama and the broader South actually saw greater funding than before and during the Civil War. Liberal Republican governments, yes, I did say liberal Republican, they were reversed at the time. Liberal Republican governments in the region championed education as a path to social progress, and local governments raised property taxes significantly, boosting revenue as a post-war, as a tactic to help fund education. The racial makeup of students shifted pretty dramatically too. By 1871, Alabama's public schools enrolled just over 54,000 Black students and about 87,000 white students. Much of the growth in Black enrollment came from the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau and other philanthropic organizations like the American Missionary Association built schools for freed people, though racial hostility blocked any integration of those schools. Teachers taught children by day and adults by night. However, white supremacists responded by burning Black schools down and terrorizing individual teachers and students. But that said, the demand for education was so strong that often Black churches stepped in to fill that void of education and keep it going. Alabama Republicans backed free public education through the Reconstruction. The 1868 Constitution allocated 20% of state revenue, poll tax proceeds, and school land sale income to fund free schooling for ages 5 all the way to 21. They also created the State Board of Education within the State Department of Education. The board was also permitted separate schools wherever white communities objected to integration, which was pretty much everywhere. And that itself launched a chronically underfunded dual system that the state struggled with for years. To ease white resistance to Black instruction, the state replaced the Freedmen's Bureau teachers, many of which came from outside of the South, with local Southern teachers who then needed training. The school built normal schools to train Black educators. The first was founded in 1867 by former slaves. It became Talladega College. A similar path led to the Lincoln Normal School in Marion, which eventually evolved into Alabama State University. And in Huntsville, we have the counterpart, Alabama A&M University. All of these are HBCUs. By 1874, mismanagement and fraud had bankrupted Alabama's school system, forcing teachers to accept payment in nearly worthless state notes. So when conservative Democrats and former Confederates ousted Republicans from office at the end of Reconstruction, education was left in complete disarray. These Democrats viewed state-funded public education as a luxury and unnecessary even for white children, and especially not for Black children. The 1875 Constitution, which again, just a few years after the 1868 one, it kept state taxes. It abolished the State Board of Education, not the Department of Education, the State Board of Education. And it created an elected superintendent role. It mandated segregated schools, and it shifted control from the state down to cities, towns, and counties, cementing that deep racial inequality within the education system. With the shift in power, wealthier areas could better fund schools and teachers, and poor rural counties could not. Political threats to public education slowly subsided in the post-war era. And the state began to increase funding for and the responsibilities of the Department of Education as the 19th century drew to a close. Most importantly, Alabama's Department of Education was one of the first state's education agencies in the entire nation to centralize teacher certification based on an exam process, which we know pretty well today. That began in 1899. The 1901 Constitution created a structure that lowered tax funds that could be directed at education, but allocated more state funds on a consistent basis, and continued to limit the ability of municipalities and counties to raise local taxes for schools. Further, a state tax proposal around that time that would have steered more tax money to white schools was defeated by a coalition that opposed all local taxation for schools, despite sympathizing with poorly funded Black education. Eventually, philanthropic institutions such as Julius Rosenwald, his fund, tried to take up the slack for training Black American teachers and improving Black schools. That's a whole other story in and of itself. As a reminder, Plessy versus Ferguson, which was fought in 1896, enforced separate but equal. While that had been somewhat unspoken as a social norm since the 1870s, the Plessy-Ferguson decision officially allowed state-sponsored segregation. That legal precedent stayed in place for nearly 60 years until Brown v. Board started the legal integration of schools in 1954. One last pivot, y'all. We're so close. At the start of this presentation, I called military service conditional freedom for Black Americans serving in the late 1800s. Dubbed Buffalo Soldiers, these individuals were essentially one generation removed from enslavement and at every turn had their legal right to citizenship contested. There was a prevailing mentality of earn your freedom through service without ever fully honoring the other side of that metaphorical bargain. And I'll go into more of that on the next slide. Let's set the scene first. Before Alabama became a state in 1819, Black men were already serving in its conflicts as soldiers, sailors, and laborers, some enslaved and some free. Their roles across the 18th and 19th centuries varied enormously, shaped by the branch of service, by who was their command, and by the fact of their freedom or bondage. The Militia Act of 1792 codified race-based restrictions on military service, mandating that only free, able-bodied, white male citizens could enroll in state militias. Still, several states and local units facing manpower shortages permitted free Black men to serve on an ad hoc basis. During the War of 1812, Black participation on both sides of the conflict was often driven by the hope of freedom and other promised rewards of service. During the Mexican-American War, the Black experience was bound to the politics of slavery because the conflict was widely seen as a push to expand slaveholding territory. Because of this perception, the U.S. Army upheld its ban on Black enlistments. Most Black people on the front lines were therefore not soldiers, but enslaved men brought by Southern officers as body servants, cooks, and teamsters. They faced the same artillery fire and yellow fever and other disease as the rest of the white troops, without the same freedom. For enslaved people, Mexico and de facto Texas represented a sanctuary, not an enemy territory. Mexico had abolished slavery as early as 1829, and the promise of freedom across the border had already been drawing escapees from Texas and the Deep South for 2 decades. The war's upheaval as supply lines pushed towards the Gulf Coast through port cities like Mobile and toward the Texas border gave new openings for enslaved individuals to escape. Black men served in both the Union and the Confederacy in different capacities throughout the Civil War. Enslaved men were forced laborers for the Confederate war effort, while free and formerly enslaved men enlisted in the Union Army. At the war's onset, the U.S. government still did not allow Black men to enlist, but that changed after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. That prompted thousands of men to enroll in the Army. By war's end, 178,000 Black Americans served in 175 regiments of the United States Colored Troops, including 6 regiments, some 7,300 soldiers, raised for the Union Army in Alabama. In 1866, the U.S. Army formed official segregated infantry and cavalry regiments composed exclusively of Black Americans. The 25th and 24th Infantry Regiments and the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiment, dubbed Buffalo Soldiers, became essential to frontier defense, fighting in conflicts between white settlers and indigenous tribes, serving as some of the nation's first park rangers, and engaging in the first overseas conflicts. They remained segregated until 1948, when President Truman integrated the military via Executive Order 9981. That's a long time, y'all. With that background in place, let's talk about more about that conditional freedom. Why sign up for the military at all, knowing you'd serve in a segregated unit, especially having been barred from, until very recently, legally being allowed to bear a weapon? Well, the military offered dependable income and long-term benefits like a pension. It offered relative autonomy and dignity in a role that visibly served the country, and it carried the expectation that loyalty and valor in service could be leveraged into demonstrated, deserved civil rights. Of these, one of those goals was attainable. The other two were philosophically quid pro quo. On the other side, the government needed bodies. The military just needed bodies. And it's shown that that was the case over and over by their limited but recurring use of Black servicemen in every U.S. conflict up until that point. That need didn't translate into favorable perceptions or equitable treatment. At the most basic level, Buffalo Soldiers still faced segregation, discrimination, and hostile white officers within the very institution supposedly granting them freedom. The condition of service, loyalty in exchange for citizenship, was never reciprocated from the onset. Jim Crow intensified over the same period regardless of military contributions, suggesting that the proof of citizenship theory overpromised what service could actually buy. Freedom was newly granted. It was not secured. Constitutional amendments established formal freedom and citizenship, but remained under constant threat. Black servicemen were entitled to federal employment, a wage, a uniform, and the limited protection of national institutions. But it was the intangible, broken promise of full civil rights and freedom that often kept them pushing forward. As Buffalo Soldiers began serving in conflicts in the West and overseas, a moral dilemma becomes apparent. Conditional freedom also means violence against and suppression of other marginalized people. The Western Indian Wars, also known as the Great Plains Wars, also just known as the Western Wars or the Indian Wars, it depends on which historian is talking and what time period you're looking at it. The Western Indian Wars are pretty difficult to discuss. We don't actually know how Black soldiers understood themselves and their circumstances in these conflicts. Most of what survives as archival record is official documents, white officers' accounts, and later oral histories, none of which include the soldiers' own personal reflections. Historians even debate how much weight to put on the irony of this situation, as opposed to reading it anachronistically. So here's what we know and what we can only reflect on in retrospect. We know Buffalo Soldiers spent decades fighting the Apache, Comanche, Cheyenne, and other nations across the Southern Plains and Southwest. We know some Black soldiers deserted to live among Native nations, and there's a separate, longer history of Black Seminoles, descendants of escaped slaves who intermarried with Seminoles in Florida. Black Seminoles whose scouts served the U.S. Army. We know some indigenous Black communities existed prior to and alongside these conflicts. What we can only reflect on is that these racial lines in these wars were far from clean. and that the stable federal employment could coexist with or override any felt moral contradiction. The Spanish-American War, which saw encampment here, by the way, the 10th Cavalry was up on what is now Cavalry Hill after the war. The Spanish-American War is seen as less morally fraught. Black regiments fought in Cuba, and accounts from San Juan Hill credit the 9th and 10th Cavalry with critical support, often erased from the popular narrative centering on Roosevelt's Rough Riders. They were there alongside them. The archival record here is richer. Black newspapers at home used the soldiers' battlefield performance in Cuba as direct ammunition against Jim Crow and disenfranchisement. Some soldiers also reported a sense of racial solidarity. Cuba's population included Afro-Cubans. And ending Spanish colonial rule didn't put Black American soldiers in the position of suppressing another, because they were fighting for a colonized people's independence. If anything, their participation in the Spanish-American War was framed as helping with liberation. And finally, the Philippine-American War, sometimes known as the Philippine Insurrection, sometimes known as the Philippine Revolution. Again, it's pretty hairy depending on which historian is talking at what time. The Philippine-American War left the richest record out of all three of these. Black soldiers, journalists, church leaders, they all wrote explicitly at the time about the contradiction of using Black troops in colonial conflict. The war followed the U.S. reneging on support for Filipino independence after the defeat of Spain, and now suppressed an already declared Philippine Republic. White American soldiers used the same racial slurs against Filipinos that were used against Black Americans at home. And letters from Black soldiers to Black newspapers noted this directly, describing kinship with Filipino resistance rather than the U.S. mission. Debate in Black church and press was substantial and extremely public. Some editorials drew direct parallels between the racial violence and land seizure inflicted on Filipinos and lynching and disenfranchisement here at home. And they directly questioned why Black soldiers should fight to extend abroad the same system that oppressed them at home. The response among soldiers was far from uniform. Some actually defected to fight for the Filipino Revolutionary Army, while many others stayed and fought, using the war, again, to argue for citizenship through service. So where do we land with military service? Conditional freedom was renegotiated generation after generation. Rather than reaching fulfillment, each war became another round of the same trade, terms shifting only under external pressure, never because service itself was proven sufficient. The Buffalo Soldiers era set the template: prove worth through service, argue for citizenship as the return. But it took roughly a century, several wars, including 2 world wars, and considerable Black organizing and political leverage outside of the military before that social deal was even nominally honored. For example, Pascal Conley, a 10th Cavalry Buffalo soldier from Madison County, Alabama, makes this point plainly. He died in 1919 without his promised promotion to second lieutenant, an officership. The Army didn't approve it until 2012, and it was not executed until 2023, 3 years ago. Only after his descendants campaigned for over 100 years for the honor he had earned rightfully. And he's not alone. Despite their actions in World War II, no Black soldiers received the Medal of Honor until 1995, when An Army investigation found that pervasive racism had blocked wartime consideration. 7 Black soldiers were upgraded to the Medal of Honor status by President Clinton in 1997. We've covered a lot of ground, labor, education, military service, in the lead up to the 20th century. If there's one thread running through all three, it's this: freedom in this era was never handed over whole. It was granted in pieces, and every piece came with strings attached. Economic freedom meant leaving slavery only to land in Tennessee, where owning your own labor quietly became a new debt. Intellectual freedom meant real, hard-won gains, constantly under political siege, funded one year and starved the next, and eventually locked into separate but equal. And conditional freedom meant that even the most visible form of service to your country, the uniform itself, still didn't buy unconditional citizenship. What connects all three is that the proof of burden stayed on Black Alabamians. Work hard enough, get educated enough, serve honorably enough, and maybe eventually someone in power agrees you've earned what should have been yours from the start. That's not freedom as we usually think of the word. It's closer to probationary status, constantly renewed and expanded only through relentless pressure from the people living inside it, never simply granted by the system deciding on its own that the debt was paid. And that's the through line of this whole period. Aspiration and reality pulling against each other year after year and generation after generation. Thank you.
Do we have a quick question?
Yes, absolutely. I'm totally open to questions.
When you were looking at the conflicts that the African Americans fought in, on the Spanish-American War, we just did a lot of research on the wars of the 1800s.
Yeah.
Did the troops from northern, Madison County or North Alabama, did they actually get to fight in the Spanish-American War, or was the armistice signed before they got there?
So,
and were there any African Americans?
Yes. To repeat for those needing to get verbiage for the recording, it was asked if the people who convalesced in Huntsville actually fought prior to the armistice agreement in the Spanish-American War. The answer to that is yes. Huntsville was a post-war convalescence location. It was not the only one. There was California and New York as well. And the only Black soldiers that landed here were the 10th Cavalry. Sorry, I'm looking at her. She's done extensive research on this. Was the 10th Cavalry. And actually, the Spanish-American War history in this town is so rich. The only reason we have clean Big Spring water is because of the Spanish-American War soldiers who convalesced here and completely re-engineered Big Spring Park because it was getting horse runoff from the square. That's the kind way to put that. But yes, all of these soldiers who convalesced here came from battle in Cuba. Yep.
There's that famous photo of the Rough Riders, and you see right in the middle, you see Theodore Roosevelt.
Yes.
It's actually a cropped photo. You may have seen this. It's a cropped photo. And if you look at the complete photo, on one side there are some regular Army white troops, and on the other side there's the 9th or 10th Cavalry that also went up San Juan Hill. And they got cut out because the press loved Roosevelt and the Rough Riders and the cowboys and Indians that were. So there's a picture of all of those staying on top of.
That's incredible.
That has gone from history.
I'm going to repeat for the microphone that it was pointed out that the iconic image of Roosevelt and the Rough Riders on San Juan Hill is a cropped image, and that the larger image has white and Black troops included in it. Shows you what some really good marketing can do.
I have a question about Huntsville. And this has to do with post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
In large parts of the South, once the Union troops pulled out, my impression is that white power structure rather quickly reasserted control. But in reading various sources in late 19th century Huntsville, the Huntsville black community kept a certain degree of political power. That is, I think I'm correct in saying they elected for a number of years into the 1890s 2 of the 5 aldermen. So they were allowed to vote, and while they didn't have a majority, that could be used for political power and discussion. And that went away only around 1900. What was it? Was that unique in Alabama? Do you know that period of about 20 to 25 years where blacks maintained a certain degree of political influence and then it was swept away?
Yeah. So the question was talking about black participation as politicians and legislators and city aldermen after the Civil War. I don't know if Huntsville was unique. I think it was unique among North Alabama, but I also haven't done extensive research into some of the other cities. I do know that it was fairly hard fought for there to be black legislators during that time period. There were a few of them that were immediately, you know, the idea of black politicians in state government especially was almost eradicated with the 1901 Constitution. But the fact that we had a consistent couple of black aldermen here, for me, is more telling about Huntsville itself than necessarily the rest of the state. In other words, I think Huntsville has always had a bit of a reputation for being a little more forward thinking. Not a lot, a little. That again, though, that said, I don't know about the distribution of population in other urban areas in the state.
I just found that very fascinating that it outlasted Reconstruction.
Yeah.
It went away, and I think it's the Constitution, 1901, that probably ended that.
And when we say it went away after the 1901 Constitution, we're talking about decades. Decades. We did not have black legislators, again, especially for the state, at least until the 60s, maybe 70s. And Kate says the city was the 80s. So, and you'll see these individuals pop up over and over again on various Black History Month highlights. They come up fairly frequently. But in Huntsville, I didn't talk a lot about political and legislative stuff because that is overwhelmingly its own presentation. But in Huntsville, politics and how it interacted with churches, education, and the economy, it's so interesting because you do see more of that Black experience being inserted into the mechanics of how the city runs. And you see it with how politicians are able to create schools like Council High, which was created in the 1890s, or was like one of the first public secondary schools here that was truly public. A lot of the other ones were Northern funded or privately funded. But you see this influence from 1865 to about 1900 of these aldermen who have very much have a hand. They're on every single board from their church to the school board to being principal of the school. They are the ones they happen to be like one of the 2 lawyers that represent Black individuals because they themselves are Black. So these movers and shakers, I am exhausted at the thought of how busy these people probably were. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it made a huge difference for the decades that they were able to serve. And despite a quick reversal of things after 1901, a lot of those good bones were still around. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Sorry, Kate. Can you talk a little bit more about the lost cause narrative and like just a brief? I know it's a huge thing, but just a brief overview maybe, and then like reading or rules that are good for further reading about it.
Okay. The question was talk a little bit more about the lost cause narrative and offer reading sources. I will be the first to tell you I have not read a ton on the lost cause narrative. I know the overarching umbrella of it. So basically, and you might be able to help a little bit with this too. Basically what happened almost immediately after the Civil War, there were whisperings of, well, this wasn't about slavery, this was about states' rights. Fun fact, if you look at the states' rights at the time, it was about slavery. Because the state's economy was based on free agricultural labor. But there's whisperings throughout the latter half of the century that really start gearing people towards this idea that the Civil War wasn't fought over enslavement, it was fought over states' rights. What really kicked it and solidified it, however, was actually in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, there were memorial and lineage groups that popularized the myth, and that they did it through honoring a bunch of veterans who were passing away. This is also the time period where you start seeing a lot of veteran reunions, and they all point towards this narrative of what we were fighting for was states' rights. That is like the very bare bones version. There is way more to it than that, and a lot of it.
The Confederacy pushed this also.
Mm-hmm.
A lot. I mean, I've always felt that they were one of the ones around the turn of the century.
That was what I had read, that they were the ones putting these monuments back.
Yeah, but they were doing it through philanthropic organizations like the Daughters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So they were doing it in a kind of roundabout way. And again, there's way more detail to this than what I am telling you, but it was in large part to descendants solidifying these memorials and honors and putting up very visible monuments to that end.
I think I'm the oldest person here probably, and I am old enough to remember Alabama history was taught in the 4th and 9th grade for a number of years. And I think we have some of the old textbooks that I used, and they just push that lost cause and theory, and slaves were happy, and I mean, it's just.
Yeah, right.
It's just really state propaganda to me. I mean, and in fact, I was a history major in European history, studied a little bit of Soviet history, and I read some translations of Soviet textbooks. What they remind me of was my Alabama textbook, pushing a party cause.
And to your point as well, sorry for cutting in. This did start right after the Civil War. I had to look up the date really quick because I was misremembering. In 1866, 1 year after, there was a full book published called The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederate States.
You know, that if you really stop and think about it, the fact that Alabama still celebrates Confederate Memorial Day, that brings the lost cause back into the century in the modern times.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of more recent books from about 2005 to the present that discuss it more as myth and deconstructing that myth. A lot of them are just simply called the myth of the lost cause in the Civil War. If you're going to look up any of these, the only thing I would suggest is check the publication date and look into the author and see what the background of the author is. Yeah. Anything else?
I'd like to talk to you on keyboard if you have time.
Yeah, absolutely. I have time to stick around for about 10 minutes before the childcare ends at home. Is this just general talking after, or do you have questions?
Well, I can just talk to them. I mean, I don't care. I'd say it right now if you like.
Yeah,
Sure.
Susie and I are on board for a historical time period cemetery in Denmark.
Yeah.
Half of it is a slave cemetery,
Mhm.
the only intact slave cemeteries. We also have an African American buried there that fought for the Confederacy and was buried on the white side of the cemetery. So could we email you some of this information and
Yes.
what you can do?
Please.
And just tell you if you get a free time, B&B Auto and New Market Barbecue hold the key to the gate.
B&B's closing the embassy.
Oh, yeah, B&B.
They're
New
retired.
Market Barbecue holds the key to the gate because we just keep it blocked because we don't want to lose what we have.
So what I heard was get barbecue before it closes at the end of the month.
Get barbecue.
And then it's the
And goes-
Holly store, it's closed.
And take a field trip to the,
Mount Perry.
Mount Perry,
Yeah.
it's 6 acres.
did you say B&B or did you say barbecue?
Well, the New Market barbecue is right before you get to
Oh,
the cemetery.
okay.
And we want to invite the people that, want to visit.
To unlock the gate.
Yeah.
We keep the gate locked.
I-
You have to sign out a key.
I will say I'm an anomaly around in my friend group because I love tromping around like historical cemeteries.
It's our hobby.
Yeah.
We can set up a time and meet you and give you a tour
Yeah,
and
she can
explain.
tell you.
I would
She's
love
learned
that.
The man's name is Ashbury Morris, and he was mixed.
Yes,
And he,
Okay.
what was that?
Ashbury, it's
Oh.
Ashbury.
And, but he could pass her life is what.
Interesting.
And I can't remember the man's name from Oakwood College.
But
did
they
some
did
research.
some research on him and did prove that he fought with the Confederacy. And, the funny thing is when, the New Market rebels got captured at Donaldson,
Mhm.
he escaped ship. He came back to New Market, rejoined a group of Confederate soldiers and went back out to fight.
Some of the records say that he died and was buried there, but he came back to Newmarket even after the rest of his service and had a family. And
Oh, wow.
So
And he was actually a soldier and not an aide or.
No, he has a Confederate,
I don't know if that monument though.
but, we had
Wow.
to prove his service to get it.
Oh, okay,
so
there we go.
We proved his service.
Interesting. Oh, I would love to come
Later
visit.
down the line, his son shows up in Michigan in a marriage certificate, and he marks himself as white.
But on some of the census records, his wife and children are marked along.
Well, I mean,
Yeah. Oh, that's so. Oh, I cannot wait to come visit y'all. That sounds great. Yeah, please. If you took a picture of. Yeah. Yes, perfect. Perfect. All right. Well, thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for coming. And our next session is going to be August 14th at noon. Special Collections Assistant Thomas Hutchins will be discussing the development of one of Huntsville's first skyscrapers, the Terry Hutchins Building, which was built 100 years ago this year. So August the 14th at noon, and it'll be here. All right, thank you.